All right, it's time for our weekly examination of church history through the game of Hot, Not, or Sanctified. And now in this game, what we are doing is deciding whether or not things are inspiring for us as believers. If we consider something hot, then it is a positive theological inspiration or role model. If it is not, then it's not so good of a theological inspiration or role model. And if we say that it is sanctified, we are not necessarily saying that the item, which could be a person or theological issue, is hot, but instead we are saying only God's sanctified judgment can decide whether or not this is a hot theological inspiration. Now, today we're going to be looking at two items. The first is going to be Agnes of Bohemia, who is a princess. And she also is a saint within the church who's done a lot of interesting things. After that, we're going to have a conversation about baptism, and basically, we're going to be looking at the question, delayed baptism, question mark. In other words, what's the deal with baptism? There's been a lot of conversations around that. All right, so before we go any further, let's go outside and talk with our resident anchorite, Athanasius, and see what he has to say about these two topics.
All right, thank you for joining us outside. We are here with our resident anchorite, Athanasius. As a reminder, an anchorite is someone who's willingly walled up within a church to spend time for penance and prayer. So we're here with Athanasius. Athanasius, are you here? All right, so we're doing our segment on church history, and I was wondering if you had some information about Agnes of Bohemia. Do you have anything about her? Uh-huh. Oh, thank you. Another scroll that we can read, and thank you for that little bit of information you gave us. We'll explore more of this in a moment. Our other topic is about baptism. What are your thoughts on baptism? Well, what about the different kinds of baptism, like immersion? Oh, a sprinkling? What about being immersed in like a pool or stagnant water? Really? Okay, well, I think that's all great information. Thank you, Athanasius, and we will continue this conversation inside. Bye!
That was good to hear from Athanasius, but now let's go hear St. Agnes' story.
Agnes was born a Bohemian princess in medieval times. She was born in 1205 and passed in 1282. She is also known as Agnes of Prague. She was the child of King Ottokar I and Constance of Hungary. However, she felt God's call to embrace a life of charity instead of that of royalty. Agnes chose a life married to the church, which prevented her from being married and having children. However, Agnes did receive several marriage proposals. One in particular was that to Frederick II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Agnes appealed to Pope Gregory IX, who persuaded Frederick. Frederick stated he could not be offended if Agnes preferred the King of Heaven to him. Throughout her life, Agnes voluntarily did many great works for the church. She felt the call of God to live a life of holiness and a life called by God to give to others. She built a hospital for the poor. She financed a residence for the friars, and even built a monastery for the Sisters of St. Clare. Throughout her life, she did not wish to take any titles, but eventually the Pope forced her to accept the title of abbess, although she preferred simply to be known as the senior sister. Her life is known as a tribute to personal charity and to personal holiness.
So now that we've heard St. Agnes' story, what do you guys think about it? Dylan?
Well, in the question of hot, not, or sanctified, I actually really enjoy St. Agnes's story. Actually, of the saints we've been learning about recently, she is my favorite. I love everything about it. Definitely hot all the way. The fact that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, he wants to marry her, which there's a lot of suitors actually for her. We didn't go into all that in the little short video there, but there's a lot, including the King of England. Several are after her. But Frederick says, I can't be offended if she chooses the King of Heaven over me. That's like such an awesome response. Like, there's always the great shame in people who have proposed and get rejected. But that's like the ultimatum between the kingdom of God and the Holy Roman Emperor. Like, what do you do with that situation? But anyways, aside from that awesome drama that happens with Agnes' story, I really like her personal charity that's not compulsion. It's her voluntarily doing these things. The building of the hospital, the great amount of personal initiative she had. One of the things that's fascinating about her, she doesn't want some fancy title. I love it when you go to some sort of public place and you see people who are like, well, this is who I am. This is the role I have. Those are usually like the least people capable of doing anything in the room. You usually find that the people who are the most suited to do things are the ones running around doing things and sort of quietly making things happen. The people who tout their credentials usually aren't the people who have the best qualifications in terms of practice. And she's definitely not somebody who touts her credentials. In fact, she's kind of forced to take the ones that she has. She just wants to be known as the senior sister, does fascinating things, whether it be in the Sisters of St. Clair, which are a order of women who take sort of this, not just vow to the church, but they have a vow of poverty. It's really fascinating. Hot all the way.
All right, Amanda?
I think, definitely hot is the short answer to that question. And especially in that time where for her identity is tied to family, and who she is and how she can work within her world is with the idea that she will get married and that she will have children. And she decides, no, my conviction is to be someone who works for God and only does that. And I think, like Dylan said, that she had all these proposals, and maybe it was easy the first time to be like, no, I'm married to God, I'm just working for God right now. Maybe the first time that was easy, but after like so many times, I wonder if she did begin. And as she got older, and realizing that window of her creating a family was closing, it probably got more difficult for her to continually make that decision to be dedicated only to God. And again, in that time, that was the only way women could kind of work within the church, was within the Catholic Church as a nun, as someone dedicated to that. And so she sacrificed a lot because of that conviction. It wasn't an arbitrary conviction. It wasn't so she could say, look at me, I'm going to become a saint hundreds of years later. It was just simply because that's what she felt she needed to do. And she ended up making this great impact in her world. And so I definitely think that is very hot.
And on an unfortunate note, she actually has her face put on a check dollar. We have a picture of that we're going to pull up. A terrible picture. Good heavens. The woman was, but there's no chance that she would look like this IRL. I mean, all the other depictions of this are not of this state, but just a terrible picture on her that's on some money. But yeah, interestingly, she actually has some other saints in her bloodline that are ancestors of her, that she's a descendant of. So definitely there's that family history of being involved in the church. But again, Amanda's right. There's this expectation that, again, her mother is relevant to the sort of Hungarian world, and then her father is the beginning of a new dynasty. So she has very important political figures on both sides of her family. And instead of being wrapped up in that, she says, well, I'm going to be married to the church instead. Which maybe we should do a hot, not, or sanctified one day on the question of being married to the church and the sort of mentality around that. But for now, just looking at Agnes, definitely hot.
I would definitely say hot myself as well. And one thing that I thought was interesting about that the Frederick guy is that, that's honestly probably how he was probably reflecting her sentiment on that a lot whenever he said that. I imagine he was kind of that her words were kind of speaking through that as well, because he's like, well, I guess it's okay to
is hilarious
to reject me if you're going to be more pursuing God. And it's just like, that's probably along the lines of something how she told him. She's like, look, you're pretty awesome and all that, you're the emperor, but I'm actually married to God. So
yeah, the ultimate diss. It's hilarious though. I mean, if you are the Holy Roman Emperor, I mean, I guess you don't have any comeback for that except...
I guess so.
Yeah, well, I guess we lost out on that one. Anyways, we're going to wrap up our conversation on Agnes and move along to baptism. So, the question we've been having is, what about baptism is okay? Just to give a quick overview of why, of course, there's the question of delayed baptism. There are a lot of people out there, there's been whole denominations come with the question of, should we delay baptism or should it be something initial at salvation? Which takes us to the question of, is salvation and baptism the same? But for now, the question, delayed baptism, hot, not, or sanctified, Amanda?
I'll have to go with sanctified, because it is something that very much is case by case, and we can look at church history why delayed baptism even started. Initially, you proclaimed that you were a believer of Christ, and bam, you were baptized. As persecution started, as various other things were happening in the world around them, the Christian community decided, let's delay it. Let's give people catechism, education on what this faith is that they're being baptized into. Because, if you're baptized into this faith, it could cost you anywhere from your business to your life and everything in between. So you've got to understand this. And then furthermore, there was a belief at some point that if you were baptized and then you fell from the faith, you could not be re-entered into the kingdom. And so you had to delay that baptism, because then there was a shorter amount of time between when you were baptized and your death, so there's a short amount of time for you to fall away. And so there's a lot of factors that go in, and thousands of years of church history and tradition that gets us to this question 2,000 years later. So we have to come at this very carefully and not make some grand sweeping proclamations that could potentially cause harm to believers either at the beginning of their faith or as they're journeying through it. So I'm going to say sanctified on that one.
All right. Anthony?
I would agree. Maybe if you gave me some specific circumstance that I could decide whether or not that would be a good thing. But given just like the plethora of various circumstances and reasons why someone might be doing that, I would say sanctified.
All right. And I am going to come back and sort of try to clarify all this conversation. Again, back to somebody's comment earlier, there are people out to get you on one side. There are people out to get you on one side if you mess up the baptism conversation. I'm going to say actually not on this one. And the reason why I say not is actually I'm going to repeat something that both of you have sort of conveyed in sentiment, is that whenever we make a big overarching proclamation without consideration of specifics, we can always create problems. And I think having a philosophy that says there must always be delayed baptism, and I think we all would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're actually all at the same page here, whether we say not or sanctified. Baptism is something, it is different from salvation. It's important that it's, again, done to somebody who's a believer. It's important that it's appropriate within that individual circumstances, too. Again, a lot of people ask the question, is it okay if I'm baptized by being sprinkled? Do I need to be in a moving body of water? Does it need to be a dunking in a pool? One of the most interesting baptism services I was at actually was at the church where Pastor Amanda is doing ministry. We did sort of a joint baptism on someone. It was real interesting. It was very private, but it was also very holy. I liked the way that it went about, just the structure of the service. But again, you can have a holy baptism in a creek. I've known people who baptize in a horse trough and people who do it in all sorts of places. And I think it's okay as long as the believer is in the right place and it's being done for the right purposes. Now, that being said, there are a lot of ways, there are a lot of formats which baptism can take place, but the biggest thing is that the heart of the believer is in the right place, and they're doing it as a step towards their movement into holiness in the kingdom of God. And that's really the stance I'm going to take on that, and I think we can all sort of agree on that.
Yes.
And again, just to clarify the language, when I say I'm not saying that delayed baptism is bad. There is a time where that's very good, but I'm saying that just to have a universal rule and to come down with a one-size-fits-all stamp of baptism without consideration of people's actual circumstances is bad. And I think that's kind of where we all are. Baptism is important. If you haven't been baptized, think about it, be praying about it, be considering it. And if you're not even a believer yet, hit us up and we'll have a conversation. But on that, we will be back. We're going to wrap up our conversation.